Three emperors of three grand empires face one another. Two former emperors, Emperor Tianzuo of the Khitan Liao and Emperor Qinzong of the Great Sung Dynasty, stand prisoner together, but the third man is still an emperor. In an act of humiliation, Digunai, Emperor of the Jin, forces the men to play polo. Former Emperor Qinzong is a frail and broken man of 56 years of age, who has spent most of his life a prisoner to the Jurchens. He falls off of his horse. Former Emperor Tianzuo, 81 years old, is more experienced with horse riding. He makes a run for it. Arrows fly, and he also falls. The Jin Dynasty was the first instance in which a Tungusi people were an identifiable entity and great power. The Jurchens, the rough-living peoples of the Manchurian wilderness, would come to defeat both the Khitan Liao dynasty and the great Chinese Sung dynasty to set up their own powerful nation, one complete with all the trappings of an East Asian great power. How did this happen? This video will focus on the experience of the Jurchens in the period leading up to and during the Jin Dynasty. This is the second video on a multi-part series on the history of the Jurchens and Manchus. If you haven't seen my previous video on their early predecessors, make sure to press on the link to watch it. According to legend, in the 10th century, a man of disputed ethnicity from Goryeo, by the name of Hampu, reformed customary laws by eliminating the tradition of vendettas among the wild Jurchens and replacing it with compensatory payments to victims. The ending of unchecked revenge between the Jurchens allowed for their consolidation and unification under Hampu's descendants in the Wanyan clan. In the early 11th century, Wanyan, Shilu, appointed chieftain of this tribe by the Khitans, began imposing regulations on tribesmen, and his son, Ugunai, brought several tribes under relatively strict control. Despite fierce resistance, Ugunai was able to forge the independent tribes and clans of the Jurchens into a more organized group due to their desire to remain free of the Khitan Liao. The Jurchens learned about governmental organization from the Liao, and there was constant cooperation between the Liao and the Wanyan clan. As the Wanyan clan continued the consolidation of its power among the Jurchens, they finally came into conflict with the Liao under Yin Ge around 1100 CE, and had additional conflicts with Korea. Nonetheless, they remained officially subservient to the Liao. Under the leadership of Aguda, who succeeded his brother, Wuya Shu, as chieftain of his clan in 1113 CE, the Jurchens would revolt. The Jurchens detested the custom of being required to hand over married women, including noblewomen, to visiting Khitan envoys, and Aguda was personally offended when the Khitan court attempted to make him and other Jurchen chieftains dance for them as entertainment, traditionally something done by captive enemies. Aguda was the only chieftain to not dance and instead raise troops, staging a revolt in 1114 CE. The following year, after a string of successes against the Khitans, he declared himself emperor and established the Jin Dynasty. Jin means gold in Chinese, and the state was named after the Ancun River, Ancun meaning golden in Jurchen. The Wanyan clan had their original home in the valley of the Ancun River, and this is where, for a long time, their capital, Shangjing, was. The Sung Dynasty, enemies of Liao, took note of this, and between 1115 and 1123, the Sung and Jin met several times, negotiating what is called the Alliance Conducted at Sea, in which they agreed to jointly invade Liao and split up its territories, and promised not to make any kind of unilateral peace. By the time of Aguda's death in 1123, the Jurchens had conquered most of Liao, and also crushed the Pare rebels under Koyongchang that had risen up against Liao and attempted to set up their own state, the Wan, or Yuan, dynasty. The Liao were finally crushed in 1125, and the remnants fled and set up another empire in Central Asia, the Kara Kitai. There was one problem, however, with the alliance conducted at sea. Song troops were ineffective at fighting the Liao, while Jin troops were successful in driving them away all the way to Central Asia. Under the conditions of the alliance, Jin handed over 7 of the 16 prefectures, a border area that includes modern-day Beijing, to the Song in return for 300,000 bolts of silk and 200,000 ounces of silver, equivalent to what the Song had annually provided to the Khitans as tribute since 1005, a bargain for the Song. They would give 2 more to the Song before war would break out between them. Despite their alliance, Song ineffectiveness at fighting the Liao caused the Jurchens to sense their weakness and renege on the alliance. After a series of failed negotiations, the Jin attacked the Song in 1125 and rapidly took over much of North China. In February of 1127, they began to siege the Song capital of Bianjing at modern-day Kaifeng, but eventually withdrew after the Song met Jin demands and provided the Jurchens with 3 prefectures, 50 million taels of silver, 5 million taels of gold, 1 million packs of silk, 1 million packs of satin, 10,000 horses, 10,000 mules, 10,000 cattle, and 1,000 camels, equivalent to 180 years of the tribute that the Song had been providing the Jin since 1123. Emperor Qinzong of Song then began carrying out a number of what were honestly foolish decisions, such as refusing advisors' advice to garrison the border of the Yellow River with large amounts of troops, removing experienced generals from the capital, and decommissioning armies and sending them back home. He made another foolish decision when he tried to get 2 Khitan nobles, who were serving as Jin imperial ambassadors, to ally with him against the Jin. These nobles informed the Jurchens immediately, enraging the Jin emperor, Taizong, who sent an even bigger army to besiege Bianjing. All this happened only months after the first siege, by the way. The Song were much more unprepared to deal with the Jurchens this time, and the city fell in January, less than a month after the siege began, capturing much of the Song court, including Emperor Qinzong and his father, former Emperor Huizong, who had retired upon the first Jurchen siege of the capital the previous year, in what is known as the Jinkang incident. Overextension, counteroffensives by the Song, and insurgency in the north meant that the Jin could not conquer all of China, and in 1142, the Treaty of Shaoxiang was signed. It set the border at the Huai River and required the Song to pay the Jin 250,000 ounces of silver and another 250,000 bolts of silk annually. The Song were humiliated, having to address the Jin as your superior state and themselves as our insignificant state. Emperor Gaozong had to address himself as your servant Go, using his personal name. The Jurchens were finally an identifiable entity and great power, and life changed significantly for those who ended up migrating south. As with other conquest dynasties, the Jurchens were always a minority within their new empire. German historian Herbert Franke gives an estimate that around 4 million, or less than 10%, of the empire was Jurchen, with most people being Han Chinese. The Jurchens were organized into the Mingan Momuka system, a comprehensive social and military system that was a precursor to the later 8 banners. They were meant to be self-sufficient agricultural and military communities. While given land to farm, the system's efficiency was impaired by the fact that many Jurchens had only limited experience with farming, and were in particular unfamiliar with how to farm in their new home. Thus, some simply rented out their lands to Chinese peasants, living idle lives, drinking, and neglecting their military skills. Some Jurchens became major landlords, while others became mired in poverty. A new script was made for the Jurchen language shortly after the dynasty was declared, but was not put into practical use until the reign of Shizong, who began his rule half a century into the founding of the dynasty. As the Jurchens were dispersed all throughout North China, they began to grow increasingly Sinicized, and this assimilation was often promoted by the government. Sinicization was pushed strongly by emperors Shizong and Digunai, with Jurchen literature even being denigrated and suppressed. Digunai, who ruled as emperor from 1150 to 1161, went as far to destroy the imperial palaces at Shangjiang, near modern-day Harbin, moving the court to around modern-day Beijing. Digunai engaged in a number of reforms aimed at transforming the Jin state from a tribal and aristocratic polity into a Chinese-style bureaucracy, lifting the ban on Chinese clothing, moving the capital south to Zhongdu in modern-day Beijing, introducing Chinese-style rights, and establishing the Jin's own imperial examination system. Nonetheless, military organization and titles continue to remain largely Jurchen, and Digunai personally enjoyed watching members of his court get flogged, a Jurchen and not Chinese practice. Digunai's zeal for Sinicization stirred extreme unrest among the Jurchens. After a failed campaign against the Song Dynasty, he was assassinated and replaced with his cousin, Wu Lu, who would become Emperor Shizong. Shizong, who reigned from 1161 to 1189, abandoned Digunai's plans for invading southern China, and his first act as emperor was to withdraw troops from the front and send envoys to Song for the resumption of normal diplomatic relations. Shizong received a Chinese education under the influence of his mother, who came from a Sinicized Pade family from Liaoyang, a central Pade settlement. Nonetheless, he was concerned about how the Jurchens were rapidly losing their national characteristics. He reinstated the prohibition on Jurchens wearing Chinese dress. He also prohibited Jurchens taking on Chinese names, and required that only Jurchen be spoken in the palace. Jurchen literature, in danger of extinction, was promoted, and numerous Chinese works were translated into Jurchen. Jurchen nobles and princes were encouraged to return to the old capital that Digunai had destroyed, but Shizong soon rebuilt, and the area had its status as a capital restored. Civil service exams in Jurchen were introduced in 1165, which resulted in even some Chinese learning Jurchen. However, his efforts at re-Jurchenization were ultimately limited. Despite the rise of free literary compositions in Jurchen, Jurchen writing continued to be largely confined to translations of Chinese works. Native songs were recorded in Chinese, not Jurchen. It was to the point where even the Khitan script was often preferred to using Jurchen. An 1197 edict demanded that Jurchen princes stop using the Khitan script and use Jurchen script instead. Shizong's very own children were much more comfortable in Chinese than Jurchen, and after the emperor's death, Sinicization continued at a rapid pace. The Jin period saw developments apart from those which simply affected the Jurchen population. The Jurchens introduced widespread slavery into China, and the power of slave owners was enhanced. Prestige titles were handed out without any link to salary, and between a fourth and a third of imperial examination candidates were passed, resulting in the general devaluation of degrees and offices. The Chuanzhen school of Taoism, the most dominant branch of Taoism today, got its start. Buddhism and Taoism in general reached unprecedented heights under the Jin. There were also notable minority populations in addition to the Jurchens and Han. There were the Khitans, Pade, and Shi. 3 emperors, Digunai, Shizong, and Wanyan Yongji, were born to ethnic Pade mothers, and the ethnic Pade population in Liaoyang was instrumental in Shizong's seizure of power from Digunai. Differences between ethnic customs were addressed by the state, with laws taking note. When Shizong died in 1189, he was succeeded by his grandson, Emperor Zhangzong. A number of serious floods in the past 2 decades culminated in a massive one in 1194 that devastated northern China and saw the Yellow River form 2 new courses. This fundamentally weakened the economic foundations of the Jin state at a time which, unfortunately for them, coincided with the rise of the Mongols as a major force under Genghis Khan. Jin attempts to create defensive measures and fortifications were hampered due to the economic devastation wrought by the flood and the money spent on punitive expeditions against Mongol raids. Song, sensing Jin weakness, revived hostilities, going on the offensive in 1206. The Song forces were ill-prepared, however, and soon were on the defensive. The war ended with Song making bigger annual tributes to Jin and handing over the head of the Song official who had pushed for the war with Jin. Zhangzong lived to see the end of this war, dying in 1208, although without a male heir, and was succeeded by Prince Shao of Wei. In 1210, Genghis Khan broke off tributary relations with Jin, most likely after hearing of severe famine in the empire caused by repeated drought, and in 1211 chose to invade, easily overrunning the defenses built by Zhangzong. the Mongols devastated the North China Plain and captured the capital, Zhongdu, in 1215, massacring its inhabitants. In the 1210s, the Jin lost control of Manchuria. In 1212, Ye Liu, Liu Ge, a descendant of the Liao imperial court, rebelled against the Jin, establishing eastern Liao, and allied with the Mongols. The Jin sent a force under Wanyan, a member of the Jurchen Puxian clan, to suppress them. But after being defeated by a combined Khitan-Mongol force, Wanyan decided to start his own rebellion, setting up the kingdom of Great Jun. Inflation became rampant once the Mongols attacked in the early 1200s. The loss of Manchuria meant the loss of their main sources of horses and cattle, weakening the empire's famed cavalry units, as well as a substantial portion of the empire's Jurchen population that could have remained loyal. At the same time, the Jin also lost control of Shandong due to rebels that came to be known as Red Jackets, who soon declared allegiance to the Sung, and then the Mongols. The Jin were also weakened by factionalism and infighting. Prince Shao of Wei was assassinated in 1213 by the general Wu Xiaohu and replaced with Emperor Shenzong, who reigned until 1224. The late Jin state also found itself in regular conflict with the Mongols, Khitans, Tanguts, and Sung. By the time Emperor Aizong, a competent emperor, came to the throne in 1224 and made reforms, it was too late. In 1233, the new capital at Kaifeng fell, and the court fled to Caizhou. The Mongols were quick to follow. While under siege in Caizhou, not wanting to be remembered as the dynasty's last emperor, Aizong handed off the throne to a distant relative, Wanyan, before committing suicide. Wanyan was killed in action. After a century of rule, the First Jurchen Empire was extinguished. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Again, if you haven't already, make sure to watch the first episode in the series that deals with the predecessors of the Jurchens. The next video will cover the period between the collapse of the Jin and the creation of their next great state, the Qing. Make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment for the algorithm. Also, click the bell button to receive notifications whenever I release a new video.